In America, where the word home is supposed to mean safety, love, and family, two recent tragedies have shattered that illusion, one involving a 5-year-old boy, Elyjah Hearn, found beaten and discarded in a dumpster in Panorama City, California, and the other, a young bride, Aliccia Grant, who in her final breath named her husband as the man who stabbed her in a Home Depot parking lot in Phoenix. These are not distant, historical crimes. They happened in our neighborhoods, under the glow of our streetlights, in the same parking lots where we shop, in the same apartment buildings where we live. This is not just crime, it is domestic tragedy at its most devastating, where love turns lethal and the people meant to protect become the very source of destruction. And as we uncover every chilling detail, every courtroom battle, and every unanswered question, you'll come to see why these stories are not just about them, they are warnings for all of us. America has always sold itself as the land of the free and the home of safety, where families thrive under the glow of suburban streetlights, where weddings symbolize eternal happiness, and where children grow up shielded by the love of their parents. Yet, behind this picture-perfect image, lurks a darker truth, one that erupted in two shocking tragedies that shook the nation in 2025, exposing just how fragile the American dream can be. On one side of the country, in Panorama City, California, a little boy named Elyjah Hearn, only 5 years old, full of the innocence and promise that every child represents, was discovered beaten and lifeless, his small body cruelly discarded in a dumpster as though his life meant nothing, sending waves of horror through a community that could not understand how anyone, let alone those who should have been his protectors, could commit such a monstrous act. On the other side, in the blazing heat of Phoenix, Arizona, a newlywed bride, Aliccia Grant, barely stepping into what should have been the happiest chapter of her life, staggered across a Home Depot parking lot drenched in her own blood, gasping out the name of her husband as her attacker with her final breath, a death so haunting that it forced America to confront a devastating reality about love turned lethal and vows shattered by violence. These stories are not random, isolated crimes, but rather domestic tragedies rooted in betrayal, control, and rage, acts that feel even more chilling because they happen not in shadowy alleys or under the cover of night, but in plain sight, in places we all recognize and inhabit, a parking lot we've all walked through, a neighborhood dumpster we've all passed by, and as the headlines unfolded, the nation found itself asking the most painful of questions. How does a parent turn predator? How does a partner become a killer? And why, in a society with so many safeguards, do we continue to lose lives in the very spaces meant to protect them? Chapter 1 begins with the cracks in this so-called American dream, laying bare the illusion of safety, peeling away the facade of family love, and preparing us to step into the intertwined worlds of Elyjah Hearn and Aliccia Grant, two names that now stand as symbols of how modern murder and domestic tragedy are reshaping America's conversation about crime, justice, and the hidden darkness within our most intimate relationships. Before the dumpster became the haunting grave that silenced his laughter, Elyjah Hearn was just a 5-year-old boy in Panorama City, California, whose short life was filled with the same ordinary joys and struggles that any child might experience. He was small, bright-eyed, and brimming with curiosity, a child who should have been thinking about crayons and cartoons, not survival. Yet behind the closed doors of his world, something far darker was brewing, something no neighbor, no teacher, and no passerby could have fully grasped until it was too late. Panorama City, with its bustling streets and modest homes, is a place where families live side by side in the belief that community means protection. But Elyjah's story reveals how easily a child can slip through the cracks of a system designed to safeguard the vulnerable, and how monsters often hide in plain sight, wearing the faces of those meant to nurture. The details of Elyjah's abuse were not revealed all at once but rather spilled into the public consciousness in fragments, reports of bruises, whispers of neglect, signs of pain that may have gone unnoticed or unspoken, until the unbearable climax when he was discovered beaten and discarded like refuse, his tiny body left in a dumpster as if his worth had been erased, a moment that shook not only California but the entire nation. His death wasn't just the loss of one child but a mirror reflecting the collective failure of adults, of society, of systems that could not or would not act soon enough. And as the investigation began to unfold, journalists, detectives, and ordinary citizens alike found themselves circling the same heartbreaking question: how could such violence exist within the walls of a home? How could innocence be crushed in such a brutal way? And how could anyone, no matter their anger, desperation, or demons, raised their hand against a child so defenseless. Elyjah's name soon became a rallying cry, his story a haunting reminder that domestic spaces, those we call safe, can also be cages of cruelty, and his tragedy would go on to expose not only the individuals responsible but also the systems of oversight and protection that failed him. In this chapter, we step into Elyjah's world, walking through the final days of his short life, piecing together the fractured moments of joy, pain, and horror that define his story, and setting the stage for the investigation that would reveal the unthinkable darkness festering within a place where a child should have only known love. It was in the quiet hours of a July morning in Panorama City when the nightmare revealed itself to the world. A maintenance worker going about his routine noticed something unsettling in a dumpster tucked behind a parking lot, something wrapped in a blanket that didn't belong there, and as the reality sank in, the call was made that would shake the city. Inside lay the lifeless body of 5-year-old Elyjah Hearn, beaten, bruised, and discarded as though his existence carried no value. An image so chilling that even seasoned officers at the scene struggled to hold back tears. Detectives arrived swiftly, and what began as a recovery instantly became a homicide investigation, the horror compounded by chilling surveillance footage that surfaced, showing a man and woman walking along the street the night before, carrying a bundle eerily similar to what was found hours later, footage that spread across news outlets like wildfire, leaving the public horrified and demanding answers. Within hours, the focus narrowed on those closest to Elyjah, and suspicion quickly pointed toward his mother's boyfriend, Brixton Mallet Gaddis, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with cruelty and betrayal, as prosecutors alleged he had beaten Elyjah to death in the family's apartment before disposing of the boy's body. The apartment itself became a silent witness, its walls bearing traces of the violence that had unfolded inside, while neighbors who once assumed the family was just another struggling household now recalled moments of unease, cries at odd hours, glimpses of tension, and now, regret for not speaking sooner. As police pieced together the timeline, the case revealed not just the brutality of one man but the devastating cracks in a system meant to protect children, sparking debates on whether Elyjah could have been saved had warning signs been heeded. The investigation was relentless, every detail scrutinized, every movement of the suspects tracked, and while the city mourned with vigils and memorials lit by candles and stuffed animals piled near the dumpster where Elyjah's life ended, prosecutors prepared to bring charges that could put Gaddis away for life, framing this case not just as a murder but as a wake-up call about domestic abuse and the unseen dangers within American homes. Chapter 3 marks the shift from tragedy to pursuit of justice, as detectives chase answers, prosecutors build their case, and the public, still reeling, watches with a mix of grief, fury, and an unshakable demand that Elyjah's death not be in vain. As detectives dug deeper into the murder of Elyjah Hearn, what began in the shadows of a Panorama City dumpster soon expanded into the boundless world of the digital sphere, where phones, social media accounts, and text messages became critical pieces of evidence, exposing chilling conversations and revealing the fractured dynamics of the household in which Elyjah lived his final days. Investigators seized cell phones belonging to Elyjah's mother and her boyfriend, Brixton Gaddis, scouring every call log, every late-night message, and every Google search for answers, and what they uncovered painted a portrait not of a random outburst but of escalating tension, simmering violence, and a disturbing lack of remorse. Texts between the couple suggested a home plagued by arguments and threats, a volatile environment where Elyjah, only 5 years old, was caught in the crossfire of adult rage and irresponsibility, while internet searches revealed disturbing patterns of aggression that prosecutors would later argue foreshadowed the crime. Meanwhile, surveillance footage continued to dominate headlines, as news anchors replayed the grainy images of Gaddis and Elyjah's mother walking down the street with a suspicious bundle, fueling speculation and outrage across the country, with social media amplifying every detail, every rumor, every unanswered question, until Elyjah's name became a hashtag, a symbol of innocence betrayed. Neighbors who once lived in silence now turned to Facebook groups to share their suspicions, some claiming they had heard Elyjah's cries but felt powerless to intervene, others wondering how such brutality could hide in plain sight. Prosecutors worked tirelessly to connect the dots, stitching together the physical evidence with the digital breadcrumbs to prove premeditation and responsibility, while defense attorneys began crafting a narrative of denial, arguing that the mother's boyfriend was being vilified by a media frenzy. Yet the digital Trail was damning, messages suggesting awareness of Elyjah's injuries, attempts to deflect blame, and timelines that matched the horrifying moment his small body was carried into the night. The tragedy was no longer just a local crime but a national conversation, with every new revelation deepening the divide between those who saw it as a singular act of monstrous cruelty and those who viewed it as a systemic failure of child protection. And as Chapter 4 unfolds, we see how in the modern age, even the darkest secrets leave a trail behind, one that can either condemn or exonerate, but in Elyjah's case, it would expose a chilling truth that justice could no longer ignore. When the case of Elyjah Hearn finally entered the courtroom, the air itself seemed heavy with grief and anger, as though the entire weight of Panorama City's sorrow had settled into the seats of the gallery, where neighbors, reporters, and child advocates filled every bench, waiting to hear how a 5-year-old's life could end so brutally and who would be held accountable. Prosecutors opened with searing words, describing Elyjah as a boy discarded like trash and portraying Bricks and Malik Gaddis not as a man who snapped in a moment of weakness, but as a cold, calculated abuser who inflicted unimaginable harm before carrying Elyjah's broken body to a dumpster, a chilling act that spoke of cruelty beyond comprehension. They presented the jury with autopsy reports that detailed injuries far too severe for a child's fragile frame, injuries that experts testified could not have been accidental, while crime scene photos, though too disturbing to fully display, were described in heart-wrenching detail that left even hardened courtroom veterans shaken. Then came the surveillance footage, the grainy but damning video of Gaddis and Elyjah's mother walking with the wrapped bundle under the cover of night, played again and again as prosecutors hammered home their narrative of a deliberate cover-up, each replay burning itself into the jury's memory. But the defense fought back with equal intensity, arguing that the state had rushed to judgment, claiming Elyjah's death was a tragic accident, the result of rough discipline gone wrong, and insisting that Gaddis was being demonized by a media circus hungry for a villain, while subtly shifting blame toward Elyjah's mother for her silence and complicity. Witnesses were called, from neighbors who testified about hearing strange noises and cries, to forensic experts who explained how Elyjah's injuries revealed prolonged abuse, not a one-time mistake. And with every new testimony the tension inside the courtroom grew sharper. Each side battling not only for the jury's verdict but for control of the narrative that the outside world was consuming through daily headlines and viral posts. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice for Elyjah, while child welfare advocates called for reform, using the case as a rallying cry for systemic change, reminding everyone that this was not just about one boy but about a larger pattern of children slipping through the cracks. Inside, the stakes could not have been higher. Life in prison for Gaddis if convicted, or the unbearable possibility that a jury might believe the defense's version of events and grant him leniency. And as the trial dragged on, each day more emotionally charged than the last, it became clear that this was more than a legal proceeding. It was a moral reckoning, a question of whether the justice system could give voice to a boy who had been silenced too soon, and whether the truth would prevail against the haze of excuses, distractions, and doubt. As the courtroom battle raged inside, outside the courthouse a different war was being waged, one fought not with evidence and testimony, but with headlines, hashtags, and endless debates that spilled across television screens, radio shows, and social media feeds, where Elyjah Hearn's name became both a rallying cry and a lightning rod. Major news outlets seized on the story, with anchors framing the case as one of the most disturbing acts of domestic violence in recent California history. While morning talk shows and podcasts dissected every detail, from the grainy surveillance footage to the mother's silence, fueling a firestorm of speculation that often blurred the line between fact and opinion, social media exploded with outrage, with Twitter threads demanding justice, Facebook groups dedicated to Elyjah's memory, and TikTok creators posting emotional tributes with candles, toys, and pictures of smiling children to remind the world that this wasn't just another case file. It was the story of a boy who should still be alive. Yet the frenzy wasn't one-sided, as others questioned whether the media's portrayal was too simplified, pointing out systemic failures in child welfare services, asking why no intervention came earlier, and arguing that the justice system often punishes individuals while ignoring the deeper cracks in society that allow such tragedies to happen. In talk shows and comment sections, some voices even sparked heated controversy by questioning the Mother's role, with debates over whether she was a victim trapped in an abusive relationship or complicit in Elyjah's suffering by choosing silence over protection, a discourse that polarized the public and revealed how domestic tragedies often expose more than just individual guilt. They uncover uncomfortable truths about culture, responsibility, and denial. Protesters gathered outside with signs reading "Justice for Elyjah" and "Protect Our Children," their chants amplified by news cameras. While opinion writers across the country used the case to demand child protection reform, harsher penalties for abusers, and more accountability from agencies that missed the warning signs, the frenzy reached a point where the trial itself began to feel like a public spectacle, each witness cross-examined not just by attorneys but by millions of armchair jurors online. Each new development turned into a trending headline, until the lines between justice and entertainment blurred uncomfortably. And yet, beneath all the noise, the haunting image of Elyjah, the small boy with a smile now memorialized by candles and stuffed animals piled outside the dumpster where his body was found, remained the tragic core that united the outrage, ensuring that whether the media spun the case as systemic failure, monstrous cruelty, or tragic oversight, the nation remained transfixed, waiting with restless breath for the verdict that would finally tell them whether justice had been served or denied. When the gavel finally fell in the case of little Elyjah Hearn, the courtroom sat in tense silence as the jury foreman rose to read the verdict: guilty on all major counts against Brixton Mallet Gaddis, a ruling that brought sobs of relief from some and a cold, hollow silence from others, for though justice had been pronounced, nothing could restore the life of a boy whose future had been stolen before it began. The sentence was heavy, ensuring Gaddis would spend the rest of his days behind prison walls. And outside the courthouse, a crowd erupted in chants of "Justice for Elyjah," candles flickering and posters raised high as if the verdict itself had been a collective victory for every child silenced by violence. Yet beneath the relief lingered an ache, an understanding that the system had responded too late, that no verdict, however severe, could erase the pain of a life discarded. Meanwhile, across state lines in Phoenix, another courtroom was delivering its own reckoning in the case of Aliccia Grant, the newlywed bride who, with her dying breath in a Home Depot parking lot, named her own husband as her killer, a final act of courage that became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case and ultimately sealed his conviction. Her husband was sentenced in 2025, and though the ruling brought closure to her grieving family, the tragedy still echoed with the haunting irony that the man she trusted most became her executioner. Together, these two cases, one of a child betrayed by those meant to protect him, and the other of a bride betrayed by the man she chose to love, exposed the darkest corners of domestic life in America, reminding the nation that true crime is not just about sensational stories but about the hidden dangers that lurk in homes, marriages, and relationships that outwardly appear ordinary. And as the media shifted to new headlines and public attention slowly moved on, the memories of Elyjah and Aliccia remained etched into the hearts of those who followed their stories, serving as painful symbols of what happens when warning signs are ignored and love turns violent. In the end, the verdicts were more than legal victories, they were societal wake-up calls, urging communities to listen more closely, intervene more swiftly, and never allow silence, denial, or complacency to shield cruelty again, because behind every headline is a human life, and behind every verdict is the lingering question of how many more might be saved if we choose to act before tragedy strikes. Elyjah and Aliccia remind us that the greatest dangers are not always in dark alleys or distant strangers, they are too often within the walls we call home, and the true test of justice is whether we have the courage to act before love turns lethal.